Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or seeking to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as clinical psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, today we're going to talk about behavioral theories and behavioral therapy. And as we said in the last podcast, this therapeutic approach, the idea of this therapeutic approach, came pretty much as a response to all that Freudian stuff, that unconscious, subconscious business.
We said yesterday, made the point yesterday that most psychology, all psychology, after Freud was either a response and reaction to Freud, or it was an extension of Freud's theory. If you look through any of the books on current psychotherapies, they're either an extension of Freud, or they are a reaction and a response to Freud.
Right.
And behaviorism is in the latter category. It's a response, kind of an antidote, almost an antidote to Freud.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that approach a little bit today. And like as we said in the last podcast, we could spend hours talking about behaviorism. And so we're going to just kind of skim the surface and talk about some of the big pieces, big aspects of it.
Right.
So behaviorism, behavioral therapies, they are primarily focused on the observable.
Right.
So whereas Freud and the psychoanalytic approaches are looking at the unconscious, sort of those unconscious or subconscious drives, behavioral therapies focus on what you can actually see.
That's right.
And measure.
On observable behavior.
Right.
Right.
And we're going to kind of get into this a little bit more in the next podcast when we talk about cognitive therapies. But with behavioral therapies, we're not overly concerned about what people think, what they feel, or anything like that, because that's not measurable. That's subjective.
Can't see it. Right.
We want things in behavioral therapies. We want things that you can see and measure and evaluate.
That's right. Because prior to Freud, psychology, there was no psychology. It was philosophy.
Right.
And philosophers use an introspective approach.
Right.
They think about how they're thinking, and that's what they talk about. Freud comes along and changes things for everybody. But about the same time that Freud was doing his work, we accidentally run into this whole notion of behaviorism, and it begins with the Russian
Pavlov.
Physiologist, Ivan Pavlov. So we bump into behaviorism almost accidentally.
Pavlov, and I think that's a great note, because Pavlov wasn't a psychologist.
No.
He wasn't even interested in behavioral theory. He was interested in the gastrointestinal system and how digestion worked in animals. And so he was looking at the way in which these dogs and other animals processed information and digested, not processed information, processed food and digested food in their...
And what Pavlov discovered, and you all know the experiment, which is the dogs would salivate when the bell rang. Okay?
Right.
But what Pavlov discovered was what we call the association.
Right.
Dogs salivate in the presence of meat.
Right.
They don't salivate in the presence of a bell.
Right.
But if you associate a bell with meat,
if you pair those two things, they happen
together
at the same time repeatedly.
Right. That the dog will salivate to the bell. And it was this...
Even without the meat.
Right. It was this pairing, this putting two things together that begins the whole field of behaviorism.
Right. And we call that classical conditioning.
Right.
So basically we have four pieces. We have the unconditioned stimulus.
Oh, you're going to do that?
Just to give the words.
Ooh.
Unconditioned stimulus, that's the meat. You don't have to be conditioned.
Dog doesn't have to be conditioned to salivate.
You don't have to learn to salivate.
Right. Okay.
And then salivation to the meat is the unconditioned response.
Right.
So you have the unconditioned stimulus, the meat, the unconditioned response, drooling, salivating in response to the meat.
Right.
When you pair the bell with the meat, the bell is the conditioned stimulus.
Right.
So we're trying to get the animal, if we were doing this proactively, we're trying to get the animal to respond to the bell. And so we pair the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, to the unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat.
Mm-hmm.
When that pairing happens, you can ring the bell and the dog will salivate,
Right.
and that is now the conditioned response.
Right.
And so those are the pieces. And so what we try to do is we try to, in this behavioral approach, we try to pair something that the person naturally does and is naturally driven to do,
Right.
with something that maybe isn't as natural for them to do. We pair these things in a way to elicit a behavior in a particular situation when it might not
Right.
occur naturally.
Right. You can pair these two things and create learning.
Right.
You can have somebody learn something new by pairing these two things together.
Right.
And we see an application with this pairing with J.B. Watson. I mean,
Right.
that's the first. And J.B. Watson was around the 1900s. I mean,
Right.
roughly. He got his early 1900s into the 1930s and 40s. But what J.B. Watson did is he took Pavlov's notion and taught, well, it was kind of a cruel experiment. He taught somebody how to be afraid
Right.
of something that they weren't afraid of before, just to demonstrate the process
Right.
of learning that occurs.
Yeah, and we have multiple examples of this over the years, but we had, the little Albert
Right.
was the big.
That was
one of the
Watson's
big-
experiment.
Right.
Was little Albert.
And what he did was basically showed this little baby a stuffed animal. It was a stuffed animal at first, right?
It was a live animal that the kid was playing with.
Right, it was a live animal first, right?
Right. And he would play with this animal, no fear. Okay. But then an assistant would walk behind him and make a loud noise that would scare the child. And after pairing those two things, he suddenly developed a fear of the animal. So
Right.
he learned to be afraid of the animal
Right.
because the animal and the loud noise had been paired together.
Right. And so we have so from that, Watson developed this pretty
Elaborate.
a pretty significant perspective that really has driven a lot of the behavioral approach, the behavioral therapeutic model,
Right.
since then.
It has, right.
And I think that the first thing that's important to note is that pairing that happened for little Albert,
Right.
there are some reports to suggest that pairing faded because it didn't sustain, that he didn't continue to have a loud noise happen behind him when he was encountering little animal.
Right.
And so that pairing began to fade.
Right.
But he did find initially, at least, that it generalized to other things. So that's where the stuffed animal would come in. So if he saw a stuffed animal that sort of looked a little bit like the
Right.
real animal, he would get scared. Or if there's this horrible video. The video itself is scary. Of I think it's Watson with a bunny mask
Right.
in front of his face,
gosh.
and the baby's scared of that. I think that the baby would be scared of that
Right.
no matter what, but because it was frightening.
Right. But what Watson was doing, Watson was interested in making psychology into a science.
Right.
He wanted to do two things.
Right.
First of all, he didn't like psychoanalysis because it took too long.
Right.
He said, we can't rely on this because, first of all, you can't do it with children
Right.
at all because they don't know, they
don't have that
couldn't do the
insight like that.
psychoanalytic process. And the other thing is it took way too long. And so he was interested in solving real problems quickly.
Right.
Okay. And so he developed this approach based on pairing two things together, and that learning occurred when you paired these two things together. Because he wanted to turn psychology into a science. He
Right.
wanted to move it away from philosophy and make it a science. And he said, to make it a science, we have to focus on something we can measure.
Right.
And the only thing we can measure is what we can see.
Right.
And what we can see is behavior.
Right. And so he has this now famous statement that he
That's
made
right.
that well, again, we could go into this and talk about this for days. But his statement from the early 1900s, again, he said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So basically what he says is, you give me some kids, doesn't matter where they come from, who they come from, their biology, their history, anything. Give me these babies, and I can turn them into anything that I would want to turn them into.
By using this
approach.
This approach that I used with this Albert experiment.
Right.
I said, I can do whatever, I can turn them into whatever I want if you let me do this approach.
Right. And so that perspective has really driven a lot of the subsequent behavioral approaches that we see over the years.
Right.
Because we get into this other area, so we have classical conditioning, we get into something called operant conditioning.
That's right.
And the idea of molding and modifying behaviors through reinforcement and punishment.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because what happened after Watson was what we call, with Pavlov and Watson, we call that classical conditioning, the pairing of these two things. Right after Watson developed his theory, a guy by the name of Thorndike came up with something that would be later known as operant conditioning. And an operant is a little bit different from classical conditioning, because in operant conditioning, what happens is the animal or the person does something, and then there's a consequence.
Right.
And you learn from the consequence, not from so there's still a pairing, but now you have the pairing of a behavior with a consequence.
Right.
And he called that operant conditioning.
Right.
But the person who really developed that into a systematic theory was B.F. Skinner.
Right. Our good friend Skinner. And you know, an important note, I guess, is that many of these early studies were all done with animals. Few were done on humans. And part of that is because of the way that human rights kind of evolved over time. You cannot do the little Albert study anymore. That's just not allowed.
No.
Thank goodness. But, you know, so a lot of these studies were done with animals and very, very controlled. And I think that's an important piece of even what Watson said. He said, my own specified world to bring them up in. So you have to have a lot of control of the environment for these approaches to be effective.
That's right. You need control. And the only way you can get total control is in a laboratory setting.
Right.
And the only way you can do that is to work with animals.
Right.
Other than humans.
Right. So with B.F. Skinner and with Thorndike and with these subsequent behaviorists, what we see is this, again, sort of this molding and evolution of behavioral therapy and behavioral theory that has focused on the observable, has focused on what you can see and manipulate and measure, with the idea that if we provide the appropriate consequences, if we arrange the setting in an adequate and appropriate way, we can elicit whatever behavior or primarily any behavior that we're really looking for. We can stop behaviors that we want to stop, and we can create behaviors that we want to create.
That's right. And what I tell my students with operant conditioning is if you think of an operant as any behavior that an organism can do, okay, like a whale can jump out of water, they breach, okay? But they don't jump through flaming hoops in nature, okay? You have to train them to do that.
Right.
So you take a behavior that an organism is able to do, and you either increase that behavior or you decrease that behavior. And you do that by using consequences.
Right.
Okay. And therein lies the rub.
Right.
Because if you want to increase the behavior, you call that reinforce. If a behavior increases, it is reinforced.
Right.
Something is reinforcing it.
Right.
Okay. If you want to decrease the behavior, you punish it.
The behavior.
the behavior.
Yeah, so behaviorism is probably what most of you use.
That's right.
Most of you listening to this podcast probably use a behavioral approach with your kids, with your loved ones, with your
pets,
with everybody. We primarily use that by either reinforcing or rewarding a behavior that you like, or punishing in response to something that you don't like. And the reason that we're
being very cautious
is because we have particular views of the idea of punishment. I think many of us misuse punishment, and when we talk about behavioral approaches here in the office with patients,
right.
we do so in a very particular way. We talk about punishing a behavior as opposed to punishing a child or a person. And the difference is critical, because if we don't want the child, let's say we don't want the child, climbing up on the counter, then we do something about the circumstances surrounding that behavior. We don't spank the child for climbing up on the counter. We move the chair so he can't get up on the counter.
There's a fundamental misunderstanding, and you're right. Parents and teachers are taught behaviorism. I mean, that's what we use. It's almost by default.
Right.
Okay. We're taught behaviorism. But the misunderstanding we have is that when Skinner developed this theory, he never talked about punishing the animal.
Right.
The word punish simply means that the behavior declines. It decreases in frequency or intensity. And if it increases, then it's reinforced.
Right.
Okay. It's not that the animal is reinforced, it's that the behavior changes. Right. And our misunderstanding is that when people come into the office, they say, well, I have to punish my child. No, you don't punish your child. You change the behavior. If you reduce the behavior, you've punished it. But
the behavior,
not the child.
Right.
And that's a fundamental misunderstanding.
Right.
With behavioral approaches.
Right. And we see that with approaches used, probably the most common, most popular form of behaviorism now is what we call applied behavior analysis.
ABA.
ABA, right. And you can get certifications and everything specific in behavior analysis. And this is different than the analysis of that we talked about with Freud. What we're talking about here is we're analyzing the behavior to understand its purpose. What is the purpose of the behavior? What is the person or animal getting from this behavior? How is it, to use these behavioral words, what is reinforcing that behavior?
That's right.
Because if we can remove that reinforcement, then the behavior will stop.
That's right.
And if we apply reinforcements to the behaviors that we want, those behaviors will increase.
Right.
And so we see that in a variety of contexts where people, behavior analysts will go in and they will do this analysis of situations to see what is maintaining a behavior and then identify ways to change that behavior.
That's right. If I want my children...
A behavior analyst I cannot imagine, I don't want to say I would never see, we would never see, I cannot imagine a behavior analyst, for example, saying, okay, so when this behavior happens, you need to spank your child.
Right.
Because that's not the function that the behavioral approach is attempting to do.
If you want your child to increase their dishwashing behavior,
right,
okay, then you have to do whatever you need to do to increase the behavior.
Right.
Now, you might use all sorts of incentives and rewards, and that's good. On the other hand, if you want to stop your child from doing something, you have to figure out what that behavior is and why it's occurring.
Right.
Okay. But you deal with the behavior. You don't. Frequently, parents will come in and say, "Well, I'm going to take the favorite one today is I'm going to take your cell phone."
Right.
That's not what we advocate.
Right.
Not that it isn't effective.
Right.
But if the cell phone isn't the problem, then you may not want to make the cell phone the focus of your intervention.
Right. And from here, this is going to leave us very nicely into tomorrow's topic, the topic for the next podcast, which is the cognitive therapies.
That's right.
Because there are, as hopefully you can imagine, there are cognitive motivators that aren't observable.
That's right. What Skinner said is, I don't care why the person is doing it. He just said, you tell me what behavior you want me to change and I'll change it.
Right.
He may or may not have been able to do that.
Right.
But that was, according to his students and his followers, it wasn't sufficient.
Right.
Because what people began to say is, well, wait a minute, I'm also thinking about what I want to do.
Right.
I'm not just being controlled by consequences.
Right.
Sometimes I do things just because I feel like doing it. I'm not getting anything for it. I just do it because I felt like doing it.
Right.
So the reason for doing it isn't always immediately observable, knowable. And so these people began to say, wait a minute, there's some thinking going on here.
Right.
And that's also motivating the behavior.
Right.
Not just that I'm going to get a reward or a punishment, but that I'm thinking about something.
Right.
And then we move into the third phase.
Right. The cognitive phase.
Cognitive therapy.
And we'll hit that one tomorrow. And it's maybe something to note at this point, because we'll hit it a little bit more tomorrow, is the idea that we have not yet really talked about psychopathology. We haven't talked about depression or anxiety or any of those kinds of things.
Right.
From the behavioral perspective, those concerns, those symptoms, those behaviors, the anxiety, the depression, would be caused or reinforced or triggered by a reward, a punishment, or some stimulus. And so, again, we're going to talk about a guy tomorrow for the next podcast named Aaron Beck, who really had some concerns with this. And so we're going to talk about how he created his cognitive model based upon the idea that, if you're depressed, how are you being reinforced? How are you addressing that from a behavioral perspective? And so we'll kind of get into that. Okay? So until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.